Hi everyone, welcome to the third week of classes here in Intro to Digital Photography. My name is Tom Wolf, and as I'm sure you've all figured out by now, I'm your instructor for the class. So what I wanted to do this week is provide everyone with a little video that talks about your first, we'll call it out in the field or camera assignment. I think it's really important that everybody gets a chance to see each other's work and also hear a little bit of feedback, not only about your own work, but also in regard to everybody else's work. Because I think you can learn from looking at other people's work as well as learning from your own work. There are a couple things that I did want to point out before we get too far into this. So first of all, the order I go with things, I'll try and change each week because I feel like when we start off in the beginning, there are typically a lot of issues that repeat themselves over and over again. So if you're one of the first people to go in the video feedback here, it probably might seem like maybe I'm beating up on you a little bit more so than some of the people that come at the end of it. I don't want you to think of it that way, and certainly, in fact, I shouldn't use the word beating up. Just probably pointing out things a little bit more repetitively than I would towards the end of it. So please don't feel that way. Also, I don't want anybody to take anything I say personally here. What we're really looking at is the work, and my effort here is to get you to raise both the technical level of your photography and also the creative level. I think the technical level at first is going to be one that is going to be the primary focus, but as we move through the semester, I'm going to try to push everybody out of their comfort zones and get them to create images that are creative and don't look like other people's images. We don't want to have images that if you did a Google search for, and Alyssa, your images are first up here, so we'll just use that. If you did a Google search for wine glasses, it would look like some of the other images of wine glasses. So everybody kind of put your egos aside. With that being said, I'll also say that I'm always open to alternative points of view. Sometimes you may see it a different way than I see it, and that's awesome. Please feel free to communicate with me and talk about it, and always happy to just make sure that you understand where I'm coming from, but also I understand where you're coming from with images, because that is certainly really important to me. So with that being said, we are going to start out with Alyssa's images here. She took some photographs of some wine glasses and was particularly focusing in on the swirl of the wine in the glass. And in her little write-up about the image, she tells us that she used for the one image a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, and then another one shutter setting of 1/4 of a second. So this image here is the one at 1/4 of a second. And I'm just wondering, Alyssa, if you had your camera on a tripod, which if you did, I think that's really fantastic, because we really can't handhold a camera at 1/4 of a second and get it sharp at all. And especially the sharpness I'm talking about is the things that aren't moving, like the table here and the cap for your camera or for your lens. So I'm reasonably certain you either had the camera on a table or a tripod or something to steady it, because again, 1/4 of a second, things are really going to get shaky and blurry here. So we look at the swirling wine in here, and certainly we've got a little bit of blur going on up here. At 1/4 of a second, I've got to admit, I kind of thought we'd see a little bit more blur than that. Candidly speaking here, 1/4 of a second is pretty slow shutter setting. So we should see a lot of blurring in the images. And I'm willing to bet here as we go along through everybody else's stuff, we're going to see a little bit more blurring. But all in all here, I like what you're doing. I like the idea of it. I think especially that water sort of swirling around the inside of the glass has kind of a mesmerizing effect. And choosing to blur it, I think, is only going to emphasize that effect. So good job with this part of the assignment. I think that works really well. The other image that you shot that I just think you've certainly frozen up the water, but I'm sorry, the wine. But I just did want to talk about one of the things you mentioned here. You called 1/130th of a second as a fast shutter. And in this instance, I guess you pretty much froze up the wine here to a certain degree. But honestly, 1/130th of a second, or 1/30th of a second, I'm sorry, is definitely not going to freeze up stuff. That is a slow shutter setting. If you remember in the module, talked about 1/60th of a second sort of being that magic number. Anything above 1/60th of a second is going to start to freeze up things. Anything below 1/60th of a second is going to tend to blur things. So in this instance, you're using a shutter setting that typically is going to blur things. In this instance, maybe that wine wasn't moving too fast, so it kind of has a blurred look to it. But I just want you to be aware of that in the future. If your intention is to freeze up something, you absolutely have to use a shutter setting that is higher than that. In fact, much higher than that. So please be aware of that. If I had to throw out a number, I would want to be shooting like at a 1/500th of a second as opposed to 1/30th of a second here. So other than that, I think everything else looks great. Your exposure looks good. It's a little bit on the dark side, but I feel like that really adds to sort of that moody feeling that we have, when we're kicking back and having a glass of wine. So good job here all around. Just really pay attention to that fast shutter setting when you are trying to freeze things in the future. So next up we have Nick's work. Nick's first image he took at a shutter setting of actually a little bit over 3 seconds, so 3 full seconds. And we can see in this image the looks like the sparks from the fire in here are sort of making these trails that are going up, and the face of the subject here is quite blurry. So with a 3-second exposure, there's a real danger of things becoming too blurry and almost abstract. I think in this instance here, I really love these little bursts of sparks or embers that are being shot up from the fire. I also love the fact that we can sort of see the silhouette of the person, but not necessarily clearly make out who it is. So there's a certain sense of mystery here that is fascinating and makes me want to look at this image some more. So good job with this. And again, just for everyone, really be aware that if you're going to do super long shutter settings like this, make sure you keep previewing and keep trying, and try not to get too abstract with things that you don't recognize what's going on in here. This one's kind of just, tiptoeing that fence of being too abstract, but I think it's really good because we can, certainly identify that this is a person here, and we get the sense that this is a fire, and so that from that perspective works really well. And then the next image here, a frozen shot, a little boy taking photographs amongst a crowd of people. There's two things that I just absolutely love about this photograph. First of all, you've taken a vantage point that is really different. You're down on the ground, you're sort of looking up here, and for me, it puts me in almost that little boy's shoes of sort of being the smallest one in the crowd and almost looking up at all these overwhelming sizes and shapes and people that are much taller and much bigger than me. So I think from that perspective, this is just an absolutely fantastic shot. I even love the fact that you've kind of cropped out the tops of people in the foreground of this photograph. Again, it just goes to creating an atmosphere that really puts us in that little boy's shoes. The second thing that you've done here is you've kind of converted this image to black and white. One of the things that black and white tends to do is it tends to draw emphasis to shapes. So instead of the image being about colors and vibrancy and saturation, when we go to black and white, it tends to become much more about shapes. And in this instance, this photograph then becomes about all the shapes of these people. So I think this even brings more attention to their silhouettes, or the human form in here. Whereas if this image was in color, I almost wonder if maybe some of the striped pattern in the shirts here, or the colors might have overtaken the really wonderful body shapes that I think make this image so compelling. So I think that's great. The one thing here that I wanted to point out, and we pointed out with the previous person also, Nick, is that you shot this at 1/30th of a second, which again is pretty slow. To freeze things up, we really want to be at least 1/60th of a second, and quite honestly, even higher than that. The one thing you've got going for you here is that nobody's really moving fast, and it looks like your camera's right on the ground. So the camera is stabilized and the people aren't moving really fast. So it gives us that sense of being frozen up. Now, if you were hand holding this and all these people were moving, I think again that's going to be a different story, and you're not going to be able to freeze things up. So I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse, and I suspect that's going to be the case here throughout the first assignment, but for frozen images, we want to have that shutter setting higher than 1/60th of a second. And if the thing is moving with any kind of speed, you've got to be up around 1/500th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. So everybody just keep that in the back of your head as you're going forward. Other than that, great job with these images. So next up here we have Michael's images. And for our first image, Michael's got the butterfly frozen in midair. So for everybody to see a really good example of freezing up something, we'll go to the file information here first, and we can see the shutter setting is 1/1600th of a second. So 1/1600th of a second. Fantastic job here, Michael. Beautiful shot, and we can see how that butterfly is just captured in mid-flight. The wings are completely frozen up here. This is what I was looking for out of this technique. Really perfect example here. So great job with this, and I also love the composition of this. Wow, this is great, with sort of the flowers here and then that butterfly delicately perched above it. The one thing I would say about this image kind of looks a little bit blue and a little bit dull. We haven't talked about this, and we'll get to this a little bit in the next couple of modules using white balance and camera raw to change the look and feel of the image. But in this instance, I might go ahead and do a color balance adjustment on this, and this image looks really blue. So just by bringing in some yellows, I think that we can kind of make this image look just a little bit more warm and green rather than sort of blue. So, before we had the image looking blue, and, gosh, plants aren't blue and our butterfly isn't blue, it's closer to white. So we pull in a little bit of the opposite of blue, which is yellow, into my adjustment here, and this image all of a sudden has some greens in there. So, that's something we haven't talked about, but just keep in the back of your mind this example when we get talking about camera raw and our adjustments. But Michael, fantastic job on this. This is exactly what I was looking for. This is a home run here. And then the next one, the image of something blurring. So we've got the bee in the flower, and we can see the wings on the bee are really frozen up here. And if we go to the file info, we can see that the freezing here, the exposure is 1/125th of a second, which normally I would say is a pretty fast shutter setting. But in this instance, we have to recognize that the bee's wings are moving really, really fast. So because the bee's wings are moving really, really fast, if we were to freeze them up, we'd again have to go up to that 1/1000th, 1/2000th, those really high numbers. But instead, Michael has gone with that 1/125th of a second, and in this case, the wings are blurred as they should be for the blurring section of this assignment. So again, great job here. What we have to do, and one of the reasons I wanted you guys to sort of experiment on this one is you really have to learn to identify how fast your subject is moving and then select the appropriate shutter setting to either blur it or freeze it up. There's not one shutter setting that is universally going to freeze things up. Everything is dependent upon how fast that subject is moving. And in this case, obviously the bee's wings are moving super, super fast. So I think there's really good examples here. Michael, great job with this. You know, if I was to say anything about this image, boy, I mean, the bee is the subject of the photograph. So perhaps we want to zoom in a little bit on that. That being said, I do think this is really beautiful composition here. Just the one challenging thing is my eye is kind of moving out this direction. I almost feel like I want the bee in one of these two flowers. Although, is that a bee up there? Now that I look a little more closely, perhaps that's a bee up there. I don't know, that kind of looks like wings. But anyhow, I think that, just take a look at the composition when I do this. You know, something like that with that nice diagonal coming from left to right into the frame. This becomes a much more simple photograph, and I think easier for the eye to work through. There's just so much going on in here, you know, the eye's kind of working all through the place here. So, you know, just some compositional tips, but I'll tell you, great job here, Michael. I love what you're doing. You're off to a really fantastic start here. So next up we have Kat's images. And Kat, in her little reflection, expressed a lot of frustration when she first started using the manual exposure mode. And I suspect most of you guys had a little bit of frustration trying to figure things out. Kat, I don't want you to get frustrated here. I think one of the ways that we learn is through trial and error. And in this instance, you know, those first few black frames were probably very frustrating for you, but when you finally got that exposure, I'd be willing to bet there was kind of like that little aha moment that brought about a little smile to your face. So don't get frustrated. It's a learning experience, and this is certainly your first real, you know, in-camera assignment. So don't be too hard on yourself. So with that being said, what happened here was you picked a really, really difficult situation to shoot in. The problem here is hockey arenas typically aren't very well lit. And because they're not well lit, it doesn't make for really great frozen photos. Now, as we can see in your two images here, you've got a lot of blurring going on, and I think these are really wonderful blurring shots, especially this shot here. You know, the blurring in here really conveys the sense of speed that there is in the game of hockey. If we go up to your settings, your file info, we look at that and we see the exposures at 1/125th, I'm sorry, of a second, which is perfect. You can see we've got the movement, we've got the blurring. That is great for blurring. But to freeze things up, there's not a lot of room for you to move around in here. I'm assuming your camera probably has an f-stop of a minimum f-stop of either 5.6 or 4, which only would really allow us 2 more stops or a doubling of this number twice. So maybe 1/125th of a second is probably the maximum we might be able to get in this situation. What I would definitely recommend if you're freezing in hockey is change the ISO. It's pretty high here, but go as high as your camera can possibly go. So maybe 3200, maybe 6400, depending on the camera. Looks like you've got a T5, so that should be able to go up to ISO of 6400. And if you put that ISO up, you're going to be able to get the shutter a little bit higher. And by getting that shutter higher, you're going to get some freezing in your images. It's pretty much as simple as that. So from a blurring perspective, I think you nailed it here. And this is really a good spot to do blurring, because blurring works better in darker areas. But to freeze things, it's just really tough to freeze things in hockey because it's moving so fast and because arenas are so dark. Little side note here, if you ever watch a Sabres game or if you ever go to a Sabres game, you'll see a flash that seems to like take over the whole arena happen. That is professional photographers that are using giant flashes that are hung up in the ceiling of the arena, and they use that to freeze up action, simply because the action goes so fast that they need additional lighting to really be able to freeze it up here. So again, don't get too frustrated. This is a learning experience, and in this instance, I think you did a great job with the blurring. But for the freezing, perhaps give it a shot with some really well-lit sports. So maybe try going out to the park and doing some basketball that's outside on the playground, where we've got some light and where you can take that shutter and move it up a little bit higher to freeze things up. So keep working on that, and I'm sure things will seem a lot more easy once we get into doing this throughout the semester. So we've got a long way to go. Don't get frustrated. Keep at it, and everything will come together. And then next up, we've got Kaylee's work. And in her first image, we've got a little fountain here. And without even checking the shutter settings in here, I can tell that you've got a perfect shutter setting to freeze up stuff. And let's go to your file info. And it looks like your camera doesn't imprint our file info. Be curious, just shoot me a message or an email. Let me know what kind of camera you're using, because I'd like to see what the file info is on that, and see if we can get that file info to carry over into Photoshop when you process them. But this clearly looks like a fast shutter setting. Actually, why don't we go back here? Did you write that down for me in your thing? You didn't. But hopefully you recognize what that shutter setting is. I'd be willing to bet it's probably 1/500th of a second, somewhere in that setting. And we can see how each one of these little droplets are sort of frozen up in mid-air. And then the second image here of little girl doing a cartwheel. Perfect blurring shot. We can see the blurring happening, especially at her feet, which, if you think about it, when you're doing a cartwheel, the feet are going to move the fastest in a picture. So from a technical perspective, you totally nailed these two. The one thing I would recommend in this shot is really kind of paying attention to your background. The background of the people having dinner or having some cocktails on the patio, I think, really interrupts the nice form of the handstand rather than a cartwheel that's going on here. So just pay attention to your backgrounds. It's an easy thing to kind of get caught up with our subject and forget about what's going on in the background. And here the background kind of interrupts her leg. So perhaps maybe turning around the other direction and maybe having her with a background of some trees or some empty space or something like that, that is less distracting than what's going on here. But for the assignment, great job. I think technically you nailed it. Everything's good here, so keep up the good work, and look forward to seeing next week's assignment. And next up, we've got Andrea's photos, and it's kind of interesting that we've got some more fountain images or some more water images, so we can kind of compare Kaylee's images to Andrea's images and see how this blurring and frozen works with the same subject. So here we've got a blurred shot of water. This shot was taken at 1/80th of a second, and I think it's perfect. You know, we can see the long streaks from the water as opposed to in Kaylee's image where the water was frozen up with the higher shutter setting. We could see the individual droplets in here. So great shot. And one of the things I really want to point out here that Andrea did particularly well is she shot this water fountain up against something dark. So we've got sort of the shadow area of the tree. So by having something dark behind it, it really helps illuminate or make the water droplets that are being backlit by the sun, it helps them stand out from the background. If you notice some of the water droplets that got up here in the area of the sky, they almost blend into the background, whereas down here, they really stand out. So keep that in mind. Try, if you're shooting something really bright, put it up against something that's really dark in the background, and it's really going to stand out from it. So great job here with that image. And then the frozen shot, little droplet of water, and I believe this was 1/1600th of a second. Let's see if it's in our file info here. Sorry about that. And yep, 1/1600th of a second. So that's perfect, and we can see how each one of those individual droplets are frozen up there. I guess the one thing I would say here, Andrea, just from a creativity end of things, this shot feels a little bit cliche. It's, you know, the water droplet shot that we probably all have seen a lot of. So in this instance, I think very, very high level of technical proficiency here. Great job with that. But as we move through the semester, try and push yourself to be a little bit more creative and try and take images that are not necessarily the ones that we tend to typically see all the time. So other than that, just really outstanding job on this assignment. I think you pretty much nailed it and gave everybody in the class some good examples of what you can do using the same subject, which is water in this case, just simply by changing the shutter settings in there. So wonderful job, and look forward to seeing your work next week. And next up we have Alexis's images, and again her blur shot, first one. Long shutter setting, I think works pretty good. The one thing you kind of notice here is the shutter setting was so long was that the dog actually kind of moved from one spot to another. So we sort of see this little ghosting where the dog was originally and then the position that it moved to as it moved along. So again, we kind of got to watch out when we're doing really long shutter settings because we start to get weird things happening the longer that shutter is open. So while I think this image is pretty good, I do kind of feel like these little paws down here are sort of a little bit weird looking. Now, if we really wanted to do some fun and games in Photoshop, we could certainly just clone those out of there like that. So it's not a huge big deal, but certainly something, again, I just want to point out to everybody to be aware of as you're doing those long shutter settings. But technically, I think you understand what I'm looking for out of the image, and I think it works pretty good. And then the frozen up shot here. The one thing, Alexis, that you just didn't share with me is what your shutter settings were here. You did tell me that for this image you moved the ISO up to 1600, which is great. That's exactly what you needed to do. You needed to move that ISO up higher, but you also need to move the shutter setting up higher, which I'm pretty sure you did because the dog's reasonably frozen up. But just I'd like everybody to make note of specifically what those numbers were so we can look at them. The one thing we do see, the paws here that are moving really fast, they aren't quite frozen up. So if I had that number, we could look at it and say, well, maybe you need to put it one stop or one shutter setting higher. So in the future, just make sure you make note of those technical settings, the shutter setting, the f-stop, and then your ISO. And that'll better help me analyze and give you some feedback on your images. By the way, for all of you guys, if you're familiar with Photoshop, you can go under File and then File Info, and it'll give you the camera settings that you shot at. But unfortunately, again here, it looks like your file settings got stripped. I'm not sure whether you were using a camera that's not supporting this file info. I'm not sure why it's not coming up there, but maybe shoot me a message and let me know what camera you have, and I can research that and see if there's a way we can get that file info to imprint up there, because it really does help us analyze the photo and be able to learn from it. So good job here. I think overall, generally speaking, you did what I was looking for you to do. Just a couple little minor refinements to make it optimum. And then next up we have Francesco's photographs. And so first of all, what I really love about these images, I think they have a certain candidness to them that works really well. I love the use of lighting here. And again, if you remember earlier on, we were talking about how putting something light up against a dark background is really going to make it stand out. So what really works here for me is this dark background that isn't very busy at all. And of course, we've got the river here that is flowing really fast. We've got a fast shutter setting, which is going to freeze that up. We'll take a look in there and we see 1/800th of a second. So certainly that works in that image. So great job with freezing things up. And then the second shot, which I just think is a fantastic shot here. We've got the blurring of the waves, but the woman here who's standing still, because she's not moving, we're not getting any blurring in here. So let's take a look at what the shutter setting was here. Oh, we don't have shutter setting. Looks like it got stripped again. But I suspect that this was probably about a 30th of a second or a 15th of a second. And clearly we've got the blurring in the waves, which really contrasts nicely against the very focused silhouette of the woman here. Again, Francesco, I think you've got some wonderful compositional abilities here. I love how you've put her off to the left side of the frame and given us sort of all this empty space here that we've got all this blurred wave action going on in. Really wonderful shot. Love it not only from a technical perspective, but also from a creative and compositional perspective. I think you've got home runs all the way around here, so good job on these ones. And then next up we have Lucian's photos. And I just love what's going on in this image here. Super fast shutter setting, and it freezes up that water. And through the freezing up of the water, we capture this really wonderful pattern that's going on here. Very compelling, very engaging. I love looking at it. It's got just a really wonderful, unique feel to it there. I also love how sort of up at the top here, it's really glassy, and then all of a sudden it almost like breaks apart as it comes to the bottom. So great job on that, Lucian. If we go in and look at what your settings were, we see that was 1/2000th of a second, and definitely we can see that absolutely freezing that up. So great job with that. And then the second shot is the blurring shot. We've got the metro train coming through, and we, especially at the edges of the frame here, we can really see how this is blurring. Be willing to bet that this is probably about a 30th of a second. Oh, I don't see any camera info on that. So again, we'd love to see what the shutter setting was in here. I think that would help us advance our technical prowess, so to speak, as we're going along. But nonetheless, I think really solid image here, uh, beautifully composed. Again, we've kind of got the train here that is working its way through the frame and sort of exiting the frame here, I guess I should say, to the right end here. And I even love the fact that we got the silhouette of the person in the window there that kind of is giving this image a little bit of life. So good job with all of this stuff here. Just again, if you guys can make note of your shutter settings in the future, that would definitely help me evaluate everything on this. And so last but not least, we have Brittany's photographs. So Brittany's got a couple of blurring shots here, which I think are really excellent examples of blur shots. Again, I kind of go into our file info on here, just trying to figure out what your settings were. And I don't see that info in there. So again, just I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but everybody in your reflections, especially on assignments like this, please make sure you let me know what your shutter settings are. It's really important that we are able to connect those shutter settings to certain looks and feels in images. So down the road, if you have to repeat this type of image, you know what shutter settings are going to get you there. In this instance, I think you've got perfect blurs. Great job with these blurs. I especially love this train shot. You kind of really feel the speed and the power of the train. Similarly, again, I love this bicyclist shot. We've got some movement in the bicyclist, and we even have some movement in the sky and the blurring here, which I think works really well for this photograph. Unfortunately, Brittany, what I don't see here is any frozen shots. So still looking for some frozen shots. In this instance, it looks like both of the images that you took were kind of later in the day, and it would make sense that you would have blurred images from later in the day, because the lower the light level or lower the amount of light there is, the more likely you're going to get blurs, because to get correct exposure, you have to have a very slow shutter setting. So perhaps you go out and try doing these images in really bright daylight, and from there, I think you might be more likely to get some frozen images. So anyhow, great job with the blurs, but I'd like to see you kind of practice the frozen stuff a little bit more, because it looks like you haven't quite nailed it perfectly yet. So keep on that, and send me some frozen shots when you get them in the next couple days. Thanks. So with that, we are going to wrap up our evaluations for this week. Everybody, again, keep working hard on things. Don't get behind on stuff, and keep up the good work on the discussions. I think in the long run, you guys are going to find that this class, as it goes along, gets a little bit easier. The first couple weeks, it seems like there's a lot of stuff to do and a lot of things that you're doing, because there's so many things that we got to get in to sort of set that foundation down for everybody. So stick with it, keep on working, and everything should come together for you as we move through the semester. Anybody has any questions or wants to respond to any of the feedback here, certainly feel free to give me a buzz or shoot me an email, or even post stuff up in the discussion area. Any one of the three works for me. So hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks.